Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to continue to look at using Access with ODBC in general and in particular with SQL Server. In the previous section we downloaded and installed SQL Server Express, and we also downloaded a sample SQL Server database, the AdventureWorks database, which is the sort of standard one to use for SQL Server demonstrations and training. And now we're going to actually set this database up, and we're going to access it first from SQL Server and then via SQL Server from Access. Now, I realize that some of you may be using an existing copy, an existing instance of SQL Server 2008, 2012. Basically going to follow the same procedure as this. There will only be very slight modifications, if any, needed. But the first thing that everybody needs to do is to run Management Studio, SQL Server Management Studio. From Windows 8, there'll be a tile on the start screen, and from Windows 7 on the start menu in the SQL Server group there should be an entry there for Management Studio. Whichever way you start it, you need to run it as administrator, and you'll know you're running it as administrator as you can see here. If you look in the title bar of SQL Server Management Studio, you'll see in brackets administrator. So that's the very first very important thing. Now we need to connect to the database server. If you've done an installation as I have, a new installation of SQL Server Express with a single instance, the server name, there will only be one instance. You'll need to make sure that authentication is set at Windows Authentication, and the username should be a username that you've got set up as administrator. I mentioned this as we were doing the installation in the previous section. You need to use ideally the same username that you use to install SQL Server Express, and or that is set up as an administrator. So having got all those things in place, you click on Connect, and you should finish up connected to your instance of SQL Server. Now this really isn't going to become a lesson in SQL Server, but there are a couple of things you need to know. The Object Explorer on the left gives you access to all of the objects associated with this instance of SQL Server, and really we'll start with the databases. You can have many databases attached to an instance of SQL Server. If I expand here the databases part, I can see that at the moment it just says system databases. These are the databases associated with the SQL Server system itself. There are no actual what you might call user databases. And the first thing we want to do is to attach a user database, a database with some user data in it. So I right click on database and click on attach, and that brings up the attach databases dialog. Now what we're going to do in order to attach the AdventureWorks database is to first of all locate that MDF file that we downloaded, and then we need to actually attach it. So first of all, let's locate it. So click on the Add button. So I browse to the folder where I put that MDF file, so select that and click on OK. And I can now see that SQL Server is happy that I've found that database. It's listing it in the box at the top. But at the bottom it's got two file names, original file names. It's got the MDF file name and the LDF file name. Now when we downloaded the MDF file, I said we don't need the LDF, and in fact we don't. It's a log file. There's not really any point in attaching an old log file to a new use of this database. But SQL Server complains about the absence of a log file. If in this situation you just want to carry on because you know you don't want the log file, all you need to do is select log file there where it says not found, remove, and basically what you're saying to SQL Server is I'm happy with the MDF file and I'm not worried about the fact that there's no log file with it. So click on remove. It's quite happy about that, and then I click on OK. And what should happen is that the AdventureWorks database gets attached to my instance of SQL Server. So click on OK. And in fact, if you look at the databases node in Object Explorer, you'll see now that I've got a real user database, AdventureWorks LT 2012, attached. Now, in order to put one or two of these things into a little bit more context, let's take a look at the AdventureWorks database in SQL Server Management Studio. If I just expand Objects Explorer out, note the thing at the top is the instance. And now we're looking at databases, and within the databases we're looking at AdventureWorks. If I click the little plus there to expand that, I can see a lot of information about the AdventureWorks database. Particular part I'm interested in is the tables in the database. There are some real data tables, so there's address, customer, customer address, product. Note the names of those tables. They've got names like sales LT dot customer address, sales LT dot customer. It's important to remember those. And if I were to choose, say, the customer table and click the plus there, I have a lot of different pieces of information about the customer table, such as the columns, the keys, the constraints, triggers, indexes, statistics. We'll talk about one or two of those things in relation to access later on. But let's just look at columns. And now we see what are effectively the fields within this table, the columns. Each column we have a little summary of some of the information about it. So for instance, title is an 8-character field. I won't explain what mvarchars and the difference between null and not null is, although you can possibly work them out. But if I double click on title, it brings up a column properties dialog that gives me the details of that particular column in great detail. There are a lot of properties of any given column in a table in a SQL Server database. But just for the moment, let's cancel that and look, we've got salesLT.customer, and the sort of fields we have in there are first name, last name, and email address. So let's just remember those for later. Now at this stage you might be quite keen to see some of this data. The bad news is that there isn't really an equivalent of datasheet view in SQL Server. You can't just sort of open the data up in a nice spreadsheet like view and see it. You really need to create queries, and a couple of ways of doing that, but I'm not really going to do that. We don't really need to go into the use of Management Studio anymore. We're going to see some of this data in Access quite soon. So I'm not going to spend any time looking at the data itself. We've looked at some definitions. We're going to concentrate now on setting up the connection that will enable Access to see this data. Now don't forget, we're using SQL Server as a specific case of an ODBC data source, and in order to communicate with an ODBC data source you use an ODBC driver. And the way that this is implemented within Windows, and certainly as far as Access and SQL Server are concerned, is by setting up something called a data source name, a DSN, which will give access to that driver. This will enable Microsoft Access to actually connect to the ODBC data source. So what we're going to do next is to set up a DSN for the AdventureWorks database. Now, whichever version of Windows you're using, you're going to need to open Control Panel. Now, you may have the small icons enabled, or you may have the large icons enabled, or you may have it by category, but whichever way you've got Control Panel organized in Windows 7 or Windows 8, you need to open the administrative tools. Now, whichever version you're using, when you get to administrative tools, you need to run ODBC data sources, in my case 64-bit, and you need to run it as administrator. So I'm going to right click and select Run as Administrator, and that opens up the ODBC data source administrator dialog. Now there are three sorts of DSN. There are user DSNs, system DSNs, and file DSNs. The file DSN, as the information there at the bottom of the dialog says, allows you to connect to a data provider. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to add a new file DSN. So click on Add. And now we have a choice of either SQL Server or SQL Server Native Client. We need SQL Server in this case. And there are a couple of ways forward from this point. You can either just follow this wizard, or you can set up the key information here by clicking on the Advanced button. I'm going to click on the Advanced button in this case and set up the main elements of information that I need to create this new data source. Now, the Advanced File DSN Creation Settings dialog lets me enter the driver-specific keywords for this data source. And there are really two that we need to specify in this case. Now, it actually prompts you in the middle of the text here. It says you want to put in the server name and the database name. I know both of those. My server, this is of course what I will have used when I actually set up SQL Server. That is my server name, and then what I called my instance of SQL Server was SQL Express. You may well have used similar names, although probably not the same server name. And then for the database, just remember the name that you gave the database. If you use the same as me, it would be Adventure Works LT 2012. So that's the name that we gave it when we actually attached it to SQL Server. So that all looks okay. Click on OK. Now click on Next. Type the name of the file data source you want to save this connection to. This is really a familiar name. It will be used to save the connection, and it will be saved as a file in a specific folder on your device. So choose your folder. I'm going to browse and save this in the regular folder. And then, having entered a suitable name for this DSN, click on Save. Now when you actually see this DSN in that folder on your device, you'll see that the file extension is indeed DSN. So, final chance to just check everything's okay. File name is there. Driver SQL Server, the server name, and including the instance, and then the database. Click on Finish. Now I've saved that particular DSN in a scratch location because when I finish this demonstration I'm going to remove it again. But if you were saving a DSN for real use over a longer period of time, you'd store it in some sort of system and protected area on your device. If you want to check the DSN and just make sure that it's where you think it is, this control here works just like a regular browser. So you could go to, say, the device and then into my scratch file in this case, and there you can see the DSN that we've just created. So having done that, I'm going to click on OK, and then we're going to actually use that DSN. So here I am back in Access 2013. I've created a new empty database, and I'm now going to link to the AdventureWorks database using the DSN we just created. On the External Data tab there is an ODBC database button, so click on that. That brings up Get External Data ODBC database. I can either import the source data into a new table in the current database, or I can link to the data source, which is what I want to do in this case. So click on Link and then click on OK. And then you get Select Data Source. This basically lets you browse to the DSN that you're going to use. Now, if you want other people to be able to use this same DSN, all they need to know is where it is, so you could sort of email them a link to it, a shortcut to it, and of course they need the rights to access it as well. I haven't really gone into SQL Server security and rights and so on this course. It's somewhat out of scope. That's something you need to be aware of. So let's browse to that DSN. I'll go back up to that drive and my Scratch folder. There's the DSN I want. Notice it's identified the DSN name, etc. Click on OK. and I'm presented with this very long list of tables that Access has identified via ODBC as being in the AdventureWorks database. Now the first sort of 15 or so are actually system tables, and I wouldn't normally be wanting to access those. The data is a little bit further down the list here. There are many other system tables at the end, but the particular table that I was going to have a look at was the Sales LT customer table. So if I click on OK, I now have that link set up. You can tell by the sort of globe icon that it's a link table via ODBC. Note also the little blue arrow as before that indicates that it's a link, and if I right click on it and go into open, I get the familiar datasheet view of the customer data table in the AdventureWorks database. And of course I can go into design view as well. Notice of course that it is a linked table though, so as before there will be a lot of restrictions on what I can do in design view. There's one or two interesting things though in design view for the customer table. First of all, you can see that SQL Server has set up a primary key already. It is sometimes possible that the table you're looking at doesn't have a primary key, and Access needs a primary key, so you may have to declare a primary key. Of course this is only for your view of the linked table. And in the three fields in particular that we looked at earlier on, first name, last name, email address, the actual properties of those carry over very well. So where we had a first name 50 characters in SQL Server, it's become a first name short text field with a field size of 50 characters in Access, and basically all of the properties with one or two minor differences really carry over as well as they can do from SQL Server to Access. So in the linked table you're using familiar definitions and familiar properties. So that's it for linkage via ODBC in general, using SQL Server in particular. It's time to move on. I'll see you in the next section.